In this session, of course, we're going to go back to the emotional balance side of the retreat. And specifically, we're going to, in this session, look at the compassion practice and also, together with that, how to deal with anger. So, compassion is translation of the Sanskrit and Pali word karuna. And compassion is the wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. So what we notice here is, like loving kindness, compassion, as it's defined in Buddhism, is not an emotion. It's an aspiration, it's a wish. It's an aspirational wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. And as with loving kindness, if we really want to cultivate compassion, then of course we need to know what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, and how do we eliminate those causes of suffering. If we don't know those three things, compassion is just words, which don't really have any meaning. So let's have a look at those three things. What is suffering? What are the causes of suffering? How do we eliminate those causes? So when we talk about suffering, the word suffering is a translation of the Sanskrit word dukkha. And this is a classic example of how terminology can create confusion. Because here, this word dukkha is the Buddha's description of the human condition. In other words, this is the first noble truth. What is the human condition? It's dukkha. And most commonly, this is translated in English as suffering. And then often, based on this translation, we often hear people say things like, according to Buddhism, all life is suffering. And then, of course, when we hear that, we go, ooh, that doesn't sound right. You know, sometimes I'm okay, sometimes I'm having a pretty good life, actually. I think those Buddhist people don't know what they're talking about. And of course, the problem here is just understanding this word suffering. For us, in English, the word suffering implies some sort of painful, unpleasant physical or mental experience. The word dukkha has a much more broader meaning than that. So to really appreciate this word dukkha, we can talk about three types or three levels of dukkha. And the first type or level of dukkha is the dukkha of suffering. And here the word suffering is referring to our painful, unpleasant physical and mental experiences. So of course, part of the human condition is we have unpleasant, painful experiences. This is obvious to us. Then we can talk about what's called the dukkha of change. And this is referring to our pleasant experiences. And here, I think Buddha used the word change to describe our pleasant experiences to help us to realize, in fact, they change. They come to an end. They're temporary, transient experiences. And not only that, as we saw the other day, is that they're unreliable, meaning we can't just have a pleasant experience whenever we want one. They require certain conditions to come together. And if we look closely at those pleasant experiences, we can appreciate they're not really even in the nature of happiness, that they're simply relative experiences. So therefore, by understanding our pleasant experiences in terms of change, that will lead us to stop grasping onto them, craving an attachment, hoping that they're going to give us some lasting, genuine happiness. So of course, part of the human condition is sometimes we have pleasant experiences. And if we understand those pleasant experiences for what they are, we won't induce a lot of unnecessary suffering. But there's something deeper going on than merely pleasant and unpleasant experiences. And that's what's called all-pervasive dukkha. What this means is that the human condition is such that there's always a potential for suffering to arise in our life, that our life is pervaded by that possibility. There's nowhere we can go or be to be completely free of the potential for suffering. That's what the word all-pervasive means. Why is there this potential for suffering to arise in our life at any moment? It's because of our contaminated mind. As long as we have these mental afflictions, such as attachment, jealousy, anger, anxiety, and so forth in our mind, there's always a potential for suffering to arise in our life. So this is the deepest understanding of the human condition, the deepest understanding of the word dukkha. So sometimes, to avoid the confusion of translating it as suffering, some translators translate this word as something like unsatisfactory. So sometimes you'll hear them say, the human condition is unsatisfactory. Definitely the human condition is unsatisfactory in terms of our unpleasant experiences because we don't want them. And we could even say our pleasant experiences are unsatisfactory because they don't last and they're unreliable. And at the deepest level, our life is unsatisfactory because there's always a potential for suffering to arise in our life. So this is the word dukkha. So therefore, in terms of compassion, when we say the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes, we're not just talking about being free of unpleasant experiences. At the deepest level, we're talking about being free of this. Which means, to be free of this, we have to get rid of the causes of suffering. And the causes of suffering is these mental afflictions. And in Buddhism, when we present the mental afflictions, often we have a very condensed presentation of the three main mental afflictions called the three poisons. And the three poisons are ignorance, attachment, aversion. Ignorance in Sanskrit is avidya. So vidya means to know, is negation, not knowing. And of course, in general, ignorance just means we're confused about something. But here in the three poisons, we're talking about a very specific ignorance. And that is the ignorance that is confused about the nature of reality, how things exist. So here this ignorance is not simply not knowing the nature of reality, it's an active misunderstanding of the nature of reality. So that's what we're talking about here. And at the deepest level, this means believing and grasping onto an independent me, an independent objective world. This is the fundamental ignorance. And because of that, we end up with attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things. So attachment, of course, is something we looked at yesterday, what it was and how to deal with it. In terms of aversion, which in Sanskrit is dvesha, in these three poisons, sometimes instead of aversion here, you'll see the word anger. The reason being is that anger is a very strong type of aversion that is very destructive. And so actually that's what we're going to be looking at today, is this anger, what it is and how to deal with it. All the other mental afflictions, jealousy, anxiety, depression, all of these other mental afflictions come out of one of these or a combination of them. So these are the three core mental afflictions. How is it that this fundamental ignorance leads to attachment and aversion? How is it that believing that there's an independent me here and an independent world there, how is it that that leads to attachment and aversion, mental afflictions and suffering? So I'd like to briefly look at that now. Whenever we look out onto the world, everything that appears to us, everything that we perceive, seems to exist completely independent of us. And of course, we just accept that, because everything has only ever appeared to us in this way. So there's no reason for us to question these appearances, because if we ask anyone else, they'll say, yep, that appears to exist independent of me, yeah. So there's no reason for us to question it, because we've never seen any things in any other way. So we just accept. And that is ignorance. So, for example, let's say we're looking at this cup here. Seems to exist independent of us. We accept that. Yes, that cup exists independent of me. Now, in every one of our experiences, we have this mental factor called feeling. And the word feeling in Buddhism doesn't mean emotion. Feeling in Buddhism simply means to experience things as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And that's present in every one of our experiences. So let's say we're looking at this cup, and of course we're accepting or believing that cup exists independent of us. And let's say when we look at that cup, we have a pleasant experience. That pleasant experience, together with the belief that that cup exists independent of me, will naturally lead me to assume there must be some attractive quality there that's causing my pleasant experience. So we'll see this as inherently attractive or attractive from its own side. Or alternatively, if we're having an unpleasant experience, we're going to naturally assume there must be some unattractive quality there that's causing my unpleasant experience. We'll see that as inherently unattractive or unattractive from its own side. That is a misconception according to Buddhism. But once we get to that point, the next step follows very easily. Again, let's say we're looking at this cup, we're having a pleasant experience. I like pleasant experiences. I want pleasant experiences. That cup seems to be causing my pleasant experience. I want that cup. Attachment. Or if I'm having an unpleasant experience, I don't like unpleasant experiences, I don't want unpleasant experiences, that cup seems to be causing my unpleasant experience. Get it out of here. Aversion. So we end up with attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things. All the other mental afflictions come from that. And then on that basis we act. And that's what leads to then suffering. So this is how this distorted view of reality is the root cause of our suffering. Any questions so far?
Would you mind to apply ignorance on that example as well?
Well, ignorance is believing that cup exists independent of me. That's ignorance. That there's an independent me here and an independent cup there. Let's say again we're looking at this cup, we're having a pleasant experience. It really seems to us that cup is beautiful or attractive. And we feel like the beauty's there. But is the beauty there? If the beauty was there, it would mean everyone who looked there would have to see it as beautiful, because it's there. But of course, not everyone who looks there would see it as beautiful. In fact, some people might think that's quite ugly. So is the beauty there, or where is it? And often in English we have this expression, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And intellectually we may accept that. We think, yeah, that sounds good. But is that of any help to us? No, because our behavior is not driven by our intellectual understanding. Even though we may intellectually accept that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, that's not how we're relating to that cup if we see it as attractive or beautiful. Experientially, it seems like the beauty is there. So what we need to do, of course, is to bring that intellectual understanding into experience. We need to engage in the Vipassana practice, the practice of emptiness, the practice of realizing nothing exists independently. Then experientially, we will realize beauty is in the eye of the beholder, which means it would be impossible to have attachment for it because there's no beauty there to grab. And we would simply enjoy that beauty. So this is how to overcome the causes of suffering, is that we need to overcome this fundamental ignorance. And if we can appreciate that we can overcome this fundamental ignorance through this Vipassana practice, this practice of emptiness, that nothing exists independently, and by getting a little taste of that, we can see experientially that actually our mental afflictions are reducing, then compassion makes perfect sense. Because we know what suffering is, we know what the causes of suffering are, and we know that we can get rid of the causes. Because otherwise, if we don't know that, and we have this wish to be free of suffering and its causes, and we don't know these things, then it's just words. It has no meaning. It's just some nice feeling. Oh yes, may I and others be free of suffering. It's of no meaning, because we don't really know what we're talking about when we say suffering. We don't know what the causes are, and we don't know how to get rid of them, or even if we can get rid of them. So if we engage in this line of investigation, then we can really develop compassion for ourselves and others. Any questions? Okay. As with the loving kindness practice, the text recommends we practice compassion in stages. So again, first practice or cultivate compassion with respect to our friends, most easy. When we're comfortable with that, we expand it out to people we don't know very well, the so-called stranger. Once we're comfortable with that, we start to expand it out to difficult people, the so-called enemy. and then eventually to all living beings. But again, as with yesterday, I think in our modern society we need to add one more step at the very beginning, and that is to cultivate compassion for ourselves first. Because if we're not compassionate to ourselves, and unfortunately that's often not the case, it's often the case that we aren't compassionate toward ourselves in our modern society. In fact, we tend to beat ourselves up a lot, and low self-esteem and even self-hatred. Then we need to overcome that. We need to be compassionate to ourselves first before we can expand it out to others. So again, as with yesterday, that's what I'd like to do, is a meditation, cultivating compassion, starting with ourselves, expanding out to others. And then after the meditation, I'd like to look at anger, what it is, and why is it actually that we find it so difficult to have compassion for people who behave badly, particularly toward ourselves, and why therefore is it so difficult to have compassion for them. We'll look at that after the meditation. But let's first do the practice. Sure.
What's the opposite of ignorance? Like, if it's not independent, so it's connected to me, this cup, for example, it's something that I can create anything from it, and it's part of the world, and all the world is mine. This is the cup.
This is a huge topic, but I'll give a simple example that may help us to understand something. Is this big? It's big? Is it big? So big can't exist on its own, can it? You can only have big relative to small. You can't have big and small, okay? Just like that, you can't have up without down, in without out. Just like that, you can't have me without not me. You can't have me without you. You can't have me without the world. You can't have subject without object. You can't have experiencer without experienced. Yeah? So, if we're experiencing the cup, we're the experiencer, that's the experienced. So you can't have cup without experiencer. But there's a lot more to be talked about, but that's a starting point. Huh? Yes, we spent a whole day on that. Yes, in my 10-day introduction to Buddhism, we spent a whole day on this. And that's just a and that's just a brief introduction as well.
Which day is it for you here?
What's that?
Which day is it for you here? It's not day 6.
But I will be actually in the 10-day retreat in Yehiam. I'll be spending a whole day on this. The last day. Not the last full day. We're going to touch on this. Okay.